It was a ghost, a rumor, an insult to the Luftwaffe's flawless precision. They were the masters of the sky, flying machines crafted from the finest German steel and engineering. Their expectation was simple: dominate. But on that first sortie over the English Channel, the pilots of the formidable Messerschmitt Bf 109 spotted it, a twin-engine bomber made of wood, a toy. They banked, sneering, ready for the easy kill. They pushed the throttle. The gap narrowed. And then the wooden ghost accelerated. It didn't just pull away. It vanished. In the silent cockpit, a chilling realization took hold. They could not catch it. The sky above the Channel in late 1941 was a domain already conquered, a place where German wings held the undisputed title of supremacy. Men like Oberleutnant Karl Heinkel embodied this victory. Heinkel flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a deadly sharp-nosed weapon that was the pinnacle of air-cooled aggression. He had an unshakable confidence built on 2 years of aerial kills, a confidence that was, in truth, an expectation of physics. Iron and fire held sway over air and canvas. This was the gospel of modern warfare. On a cold November afternoon, high over the churning gray water, Heinkel and his wingmen were vectored toward an intruder. The report was vague, a fast twin traveling at unusual altitude. Heinkel snorted, a brief dismissive sound over the radio. Twin engine meant bomber. Bomber meant slow. Bomber meant a victim waiting for the inevitable cut of his cannon fire. They pushed their Messerschmitts into a gentle dive, their engines screaming the powerful song of Daimler-Benz engineering. Down below, small and dark against the mottled gray, was the shape. As they closed, Heinkel squinted, his breath frosting briefly on the canopy glass. The shape was clean. Too clean. It looked less like a machine of war and more like a glider dressed in combat colors. Where was the necessary armor? Where was the defensive armament that bulked out every Allied bomber? It was a twin-engine aircraft, certainly, but it seemed impossibly slender, a long, lean projectile designed only for speed. Heinkel keyed his radio, the contempt clear in his voice. "It is a monstrosity, Hans. Look at it. What is it made of? Paper?" The wingman replied, "The report said plywood, Herr Oberleutnant. They are calling it the Wooden Wonder." Plywood? The word hung in the cockpit, a deep professional insult. The greatest air force in the world was being challenged by a machine crafted from the same material as a child's toy. It was grotesque. It defied the very principle of robust military design. This was the moment of expectation. Heinkel rolled his Bf 109 onto its side, leveling off behind the aircraft, now barely a kilometer distant. He had the advantage of surprise, the advantage of altitude, and the undeniable advantage of flying a machine purpose-built for interception. He advanced the throttle, the stick vibrating in his grip, the nose of his Messerschmitt aimed perfectly at the enemy's tail. He expected the gap to vanish swiftly, a matter of seconds before he pulled the trigger and shattered the plywood structure into 1,000 splinters. The pursuit began. His speed built. 500 kilometers per hour, 550, 600. The gap narrowed, yes, but far too slowly. Heinkel pushed the engine further, sacrificing altitude for raw velocity, his heart beginning to beat with a strange, unpleasant urgency. Where was the drag? The twin-engine machine ahead, the one made of cheap wood, seemed to slice through the air with no friction at all. Then the unthinkable happened. The Mosquito's nose dipped slightly. Its powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same ones that powered the despised Spitfire, let loose a terrifying, sustained roar that Heinkel could almost hear even through the roar of his own engine. The dark shape in front of him did not just accelerate, it seemed to defy the known laws of aerodynamic resistance. The chase became a desperate, confused scramble. Heinkel's speed stabilized at his limit. The Mosquito's speed did not. The gap, which he had been diligently closing, ceased narrowing. Then, impossibly, painfully, it began to widen. "Throttle maximum!" Heinkel yelled, the order unnecessary, directed only at the sinking panic in his gut. His plane shuddered. He was at maximum power, his machine giving everything it had, yet the wooden mockery was pulling away with effortless grace. It was not evading, it was simply outrunning. Within 30 seconds, the Mosquito was no longer an easy target. Within a minute, it was a rapidly shrinking speck. Heinkel felt a suffocating icy coldness that had nothing to do with the altitude. He leveled out, his gun sight empty, his cannons silent, his heart pounding a frantic, confused rhythm. The Mosquito, the plane of plywood and desperation, had just rendered the Luftwaffe's finest interceptor irrelevant. Heinkel stared at the empty space where his prey had been, the sunlight glinting mockingly off his metal propeller. It wasn't just an escape, it was a humiliation. They had engaged a bomber and been left standing still. The air had been heavy with the promise of domination. Now it was just the empty, echoing silence of a deep, chilling realization. They were no longer the absolute masters of the sky. The age of steel had just met its match in the age of speed. And they had no answer. The dark, oil-stained cavern of the German hangar at Jever was a temple built to the god of heavy industry. Everything smelled of cold aluminum, burned fuel, and precision-engineered steel. Here, maintenance crews worked under harsh lights, meticulously inspecting the scarred, powerful fuselages of the Messerschmitts, machines designed to endure a beating and deliver a devastating punch. They were glorious artifacts of German ingenuity, forged in the deep, unshakable belief that complexity and robustness meant victory. They were heavy, yes, but that weight was the comforting presence of armor. It was the necessary cost of overwhelming power. The reports filtering down from the frustrated pilots were therefore met with a growing, profound skepticism. A twin-engine reconnaissance plane, reportedly made of wood, was outrunning their Jaeger at altitude. The pilots, veterans all, landed with tales not of a tough fight, but of a vanishing act. They spoke of the new British intruder not as an aircraft, but as a meteorological event, a streak of black that appeared and was gone before the firing solution could be locked. This growing dissonance on the German side was the silent fuel for the project that had birthed the Nemesis. On the other side of the channel, in the quieter, more desperate hangars of Hatfield, the de Havilland team had approached the same problem, air superiority, with an almost heretical philosophy. While German engineers piled on cannon and armor, British designers, led by Geoffrey de Havilland, elected to strip the concept of a bomber bare. The mandate was not to survive a fight, but to avoid it entirely. It was a design born of wartime constraint and radical foresight. The essential ingredient was not fine German aluminum, but plywood and balsa wood. This was no compromise. It was the secret weapon. In the workshops, the air did not smell of oil and grit, but of fragrant adhesives and fine sawdust. Here, cabinet makers and furniture manufacturers, people who had never built a warplane, were utilized for their unique craft. They laminated thin sheets of wood using a balsa core in a method akin to modern composite building. The resulting monocoque structure was revolutionary. It required no heavy internal skeleton. It was incredibly light. But most critically, once sanded, coated, and painted, the wooden shell achieved a surface finish that was almost perfectly smooth. It slipped through the atmosphere like a needle through silk, defying the turbulence and friction that dragged heavily on riveted, metal-skinned aircraft. The design was elegant, almost silent in its perfection. There was a profound quietude within the wooden cockpit of the Mosquito, a feeling of being sealed off from the mechanical violence of the engines. Pilots who flew it spoke of the machine in hushed tones. It felt less like a heavy machine and more like an extension of themselves. Juxtapose this against the experience of Heinkel hours after his failed pursuit. Back at Yevor, the noise of his Messerschmitt engine cooling was a series of loud metallic ticks that echoed the failure. The plane, majestic on the ground, felt suddenly clumsy in the harsh light of his memory. He remembered the deafening, frantic thrum of the Daimler-Benz engine at maximum throttle, the whole frame shaking with the effort. That violence, that sheer output of brute force, had been utterly rejected by the silent, sleek wooden machine ahead. Heinkel, reviewing the mission, report scrawled a note in the margins. The enemy has achieved a speed greater than our best high-altitude fighter. It carries bombs. This cannot be sustained. This was the beginning of the strategic shift. The Mosquito, the wooden wonder, was not merely fast, it was faster than the German response mechanism. It bypassed the entire doctrine of interception. The German belief that technology must be heavy, complex, and armored was collapsing under the lightweight speed of a plywood airframe. The insult was becoming an inescapable, terrifying fact. A machine initially dismissed as a primitive curiosity was now threatening to render the steel-winged masters of the air obsolete. The silent wooden ghost was forcing the mighty Luftwaffe to look inward, not just at its engines, but at its very philosophy of war. The sun on January 30th, 1943, was a pale, indifferent eye over Berlin. This was the birthday of the Reichs Chancellor, a day of enforced celebration, and the city's skies, by decree and by doctrine, were meant to be sacrosanct. The very idea of an enemy aircraft penetrating this deep in daylight was a strategic impossibility, a declaration of absolute failure. Yet the alarm sounded, sharp and humiliating, shattering the illusion of security. Major Erich Rall, holder of the Knight's Cross and architect of 50 confirmed kills, was scrambled from his base outside the capital. Rall was not merely a pilot, he was a living extension of the Luftwaffe's belief in itself. His Focke-Wulf Fw was a brutal, muscular fighter, heavily armed, designed to smash its way through enemy formations. He knew the sky better than the ground. Failure was an abstraction, reserved for lesser men and inferior machines. His target was designated as a high-speed intruder, the now infamous Holzflugzeug, the wooden airplane. Rall sneered in his oxygen mask. Wood or steel, it mattered little. He had been taught that speed was finite, and given enough pursuit time, superior piloting and firepower would always prevail. He was vectoring toward the Berlin Rundfunkhaus, the main radio station which was being deliberately, impudently attacked on this day of all days. The mission began as a surge of pure anticipation. Rall pushed the throttle, the massive BMW radial engine responding with a deep, resonant growl, a sound of heavy, coiled power. He gained altitude rapidly, the air thinning around him, the city shrinking into a geometric map of his ambition. Then he saw it. Two dark shapes, clean and swift, already low over the city rooftops. They were moving with a velocity that defied his initial calculations. He banked hard, entering the chase, his hands steady on the stick. The pursuit was agonizing. He poured coal into the engine, coaxing every possible kilometer per hour from the Fw-190. The distance between them began to close, a slow, grudging victory for his heavy machine. I have them, he thought, his heart hammering not with fear, but with the hunter's bloodlust. The Mosquitoes, piloted by squadron leaders John de Mornay-Waller and Robert Bowes, were masters of low-level speed, using the very density of the air they skimmed to their advantage. Rall descended, fighting the urge to fire too soon. He adjusted his aim for the necessary lead. The tension built, a tight metallic wire stretched between his finger and the trigger. He needed just a few hundred more meters. But the Mosquitoes, knowing precisely the limitations of their pursuer, adjusted. They had released their bombs in a devastating, symbolic strike, and now, relieved of the payload, they poured on speed. The engine noise in Rall's cockpit reached a frantic, deafening crescendo, yet the distance remained the same. He clenched his teeth, fighting the turbulence, trying to keep the twin fuselages of the Mosquitoes centered in his sight. His finger squeezed the trigger, a short, desperate burst of 20mm cannon fire. The heavy steel rounds tracked, but fell short, exploding harmlessly in the empty air behind the sleek, dark wooden tails. He was too late. The Mosquitoes did not maneuver, they simply pulled away. It was not evasive action born of fear, but pure, elegant physics. Rall watched, paralyzed by the sight, as the two dark shapes accelerated beyond the reach of his guns, leaving his shells trailing after them like spent energy. He pushed the stick forward, desperate, but his FW-190 could give no more. The gap widened, slowly at first, then rapidly, until the Mosquitoes were nothing but two smudges of smoke and distance against the horizon. Rall broke off the chase, circling the violated city. The fury that engulfed him was colder than the high-altitude air. It was a rage born not of personal failure, but of a terrifying intellectual acknowledgement. His machine, the embodiment of German industrial prowess, steel, armor, heavy cannon, had been beaten not by better flying, but by a superior concept. He landed hard back at base, his face pale beneath the oil streaks. He stumbled out of the cockpit, his body utterly spent, but his mind churning with a bitter, inescapable truth. Facing his waiting commanding officer, his voice was not the usual confident report of a seasoned ace, but a strained whisper of disbelief. "Herr Major," he reported, the usual crispness absent. "They are simply faster. We reached our limits. They did not." The commander, already holding the damning reports of the successful bombing, looked at him with grim, defeated eyes. The doctrine of heavy armament, the belief that steel and ruggedness trumped all, lay in wreckage around them. They had believed the enemy must be caught to be destroyed. But what happens when the enemy refuses to be caught? The Mosquito hadn't merely escaped, it had shattered the fundamental equation of air combat. The distance remained the same, yes, but the distance between their expectation and the cold reality was now immeasurable. The reports were no longer a matter of pilot error or isolated incident. They had become a statistical anomaly that demanded grave concern from the highest levels of the Reichs Ministerium. The wooden wonder, the aircraft that should have been laughably vulnerable, was now performing acts of staggering arrogance, flying high-speed daylight reconnaissance over Berlin, raiding critical industrial targets with surgical precision, and, worst of all, doing so with impunity. The very idea that a bomber could operate in broad daylight without a protective fighter screen was an unhinging of military orthodoxy. The strategic reality was stark. The skies over Germany were no longer a German domain. They were a shared, contested space, and the Mosquito held the winning card. The Luftwaffe was forced into a furious, costly scramble. Resources, precious aluminum, skilled manpower, and irreplaceable engineering time had to be diverted from the development of their next generation of heavy fighters and jets toward the singular, humiliating task of catching a plywood aircraft. They needed a machine that defied their own core principles, a fighter that prioritized speed over armor, a new interceptor designed not to destroy, but simply to keep pace. They were chasing the ghost, and every hour spent on this pursuit was an hour lost in the larger, grinding conflict. Chief Engineer Ernst Bohn, a man whose life had been dedicated to the geometric perfection of steel fuselages, sat late in his office, the blueprint of the Mosquito, obtained from a captured, damaged example, spread across his desk. He traced the smooth, seamless lines of the wooden wing with a weary finger. We built for strength, he thought, the first-person realization, a bitter pill. We built for the hit. They built for the escape. The emotional weight of this realization was crushing. The German philosophy, heavy cannon, layered defense, the expectation that mass must be met with greater mass, was revealed as a fatal weakness against the ethereal speed of the Mosquito. The concept of vulnerability crept into the command structure like a silent gas. It was no longer a question of if the enemy could penetrate German airspace, but when and where they chose to strike next. New strategies were hastily formed. They experimented with stripping the armor and non-essential gear from existing fighters, turning their robust Messerschmitts into desperate, brittle sprinters. They deployed new, high-altitude interceptors, modifying engines for peak performance in the thin upper air where the Mosquito often flew. Yet, for every modification they implemented, the British seemed to adapt, pushing the wooden machine an extra few kilometers per hour faster, an extra few hundred meters higher. The Mosquito was not static. It was a rapidly evolving threat that continually shifted the goalposts of aerial combat. The psychological toll was beginning to manifest in the highest echelons of the Luftwaffe command. General Major Adolf Galland, a man who understood the air war intimately, knew what this meant. He watched the mission reports pile up, raids successfully executed, reconnaissance completed, intercepts aborted. It is not just a bomber, he reflected, gazing out at the hangar where magnificent heavy fighters sat waiting. It is a forecast. If one nation can build an aircraft that makes all our defensive systems obsolete, what comes next? The Mosquito was proof that the enemy had found a way to achieve parity, even superiority, with vastly fewer resources, simply by changing the rules of the game. It was a terrifying thought. The meticulous, comprehensive German war machine was being forced to react to a design built on elegant simplicity. The shift was palpable, moving from the aggressive confidence of, "We will catch it," to the quiet, gnawing anxiety of, "How do we survive it?" The pilots were no longer chasing a target. They were pursuing a technological disparity. Every German pilot scrambled now carried the double burden of the enemy's speed and the command's desperate hope. The presence of the Mosquito, the shadow of vulnerability, meant that control had been ceded. The sky was still vast, but the feeling of invincibility, the expectation of dominance, had vanished with the slick black blur of wood and engine that no German pilot could yet touch. The war for the men of the Luftwaffe had just gotten much, much lonelier. The answer, they believed, lay in the new prototype. It was the last best hope of the Luftwaffe to restore the natural order. They called it the Do 335 Pfeil, the Arrow. It was a brutal, magnificent machine, a twin-engine fighter designed to hit speeds that promised to finally exceed the Mosquito's baffling velocity. The engineers had thrown off the constraints of doctrine, not by stripping the fighter, but by redesigning its very geometry, placing one engine in the front and one at the rear, a powerful, desperate attempt to outrun the Ghost with sheer innovation. This day, high above the Rhine, was the final proving ground. Two Mosquitoes, returning from a deep strike, were intercepted by Major Hermann Klemm in the Pfeil. Klemm was a pilot of exceptional skill, and his cockpit was a fortress of technological promise. He had been promised that this machine was the solution. The tension was not just in the airframe, it was in the entire German High Command, who waited, silent, for the outcome of this definitive race. Klemm found the Mosquitoes easily. They were cruising, arrogant in their speed. He pushed the throttles forward. The twin engines of the Pfeil howled, a sound of incredible, unrestrained power. He watched the airspeed indicator climb, 700 kilometers per hour, then 730. He was faster than any production fighter they had. "I have them," he realized, the familiar surge of confidence returning. He began to close the distance. He was gaining. Slowly, irrevocably, the gap between the Mosquitoes and the Pfeil shrank. This time, there was no immediate acceleration from the British. This time, German technology was winning the physics debate. Klemm's hand tightened on the trigger, the Mosquitoes now firmly in his sight. He was ready to end the legend, to erase the insult of the wooden wonder. Then the Mosquitoes, seeing the aggressive closure, did the only thing they needed to do. They executed a rapid, shallow dive. They were lighter, cleaner, and built for speed at all costs. The Pfeil, burdened by its necessary size and the complexity of its design, could not match the sudden downward acceleration without risking structural integrity. Clem fought to hold pace, the airframe protesting the sudden stress, the instruments blurring. He tried a last, desperate burst of fire. He was too late. The Mosquitoes bottomed out their dive, gaining a crucial margin of speed, and pulled into a shallow climb that Clem simply could not sustain without losing velocity. He watched them disappear, not because his machine was slow, but because even their latest, most radical solution was only just fast enough to momentarily catch up, but never fast enough to dominate. He landed the Do-335, the future of German air power, and the realization that settled over him was not rage, but a chilling, profound understanding. It wasn't a fluke. It was not pilot skill or a lucky maneuver. It was a fundamental technological defeat, born of misplaced pride. The ultimate irony hung heavy in the high-altitude air. The German machine, built with the best resources, the finest steel, and the deepest belief in its own technological superiority, was continuously being frustrated by an aircraft dismissed as primitive, made of wood, glued together by furniture builders. The Germans had focused on the glorious fight, believing that strength and armor were the defining virtues of a war machine. The British, in their desperation and pragmatic ingenuity, had focused on the elegant escape, proving that in war the simplest answer is often the deadliest. This was the end of invincibility, not with a bang of a devastating new bomb, but with the quiet, unsettling realization that the principles they had held sacred were flawed. They had chased speed with brute force, while the enemy had found speed through lightness and grace. And so we are left to consider the quiet, unseen battles, the ones that happen in the factory and the mind. The war was decided as much in the workshops of Hatfield, where wood and glue were transformed into a deadly projectile, as it was in the violent skies over Berlin. The Mosquito was a weapon that changed the strategic calculus, forcing the mighty to acknowledge that sometimes the true path to victory lies not in overwhelming power, but in the audacity of simplicity.